In the summer of 1453, England received devastating news: the fall of Bordeaux. This was not merely the loss of a city, it marked the end of England's last major holding in France after more than a century of war. With Bordeaux gone, the Hundred Years' War was effectively over, and for England, it had ended in failure. But this was more than a political defeat. For King Henry VI, the loss of Bordeaux triggered a psychological collapse. In August, he suddenly withdrew into himself, ceased speaking, and stopped responding to those around him. He entered what contemporaries described as a state of living without awareness, silent, immobile, unresponsive. He remained in this condition for nearly a year. He gave no orders, issued no decisions, and displayed no awareness of his surroundings. By all accounts, he was alive, but not ruling. Modern historians have speculated that the episode may have been a form of catatonic schizophrenia or a severe depressive break. Of course, no such diagnosis existed in the 15th century, but politically the implications were clear. England had no king in any functional sense. Henry's madness was not merely a health crisis, it was a constitutional one. In England, the monarch was not just a symbolic figurehead, but an active centre of governance. Now, with the rightful king unconscious and incapable of rule, the machinery of government faced paralysis. At this critical moment, attention turned to a figure who had long been sidelined: Richard, Duke of York. York had spent the last year in political retreat at Kenilworth, having been pushed aside after the failed uprising at Dartford in 1452. But now circumstances had changed. The king was incapacitated, Queen Margaret was pregnant, and the government remained in the hands of controversial figures like Somerset. The political nation was clearly in search of a new stabilising force. York's return to the political stage was, in many ways, a reluctant but necessary solution. In November 1453, he was formally summoned to court. However, he was not immediately granted authority. Instead, attention turned to Queen Margaret, who gave birth to a son, Edward, born at Westminster, and proclaimed heir to the throne. The timing of this birth was significant. It appeared to be a calculated effort to weaken York's potential claim to the crown. Yet the king remained incapacitated, and the kingdom could not function in his absence. In March 1454, York was officially named Lord Protector of the realm. This was a temporary position, akin to a prime ministership. He would govern in the king's name, but his authority would cease if and when the king recovered. This appointment temporarily restructured the balance of power in England. During his protectorship, York allied himself with powerful nobles such as the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick. Parliament was reactivated. Fiscal discipline was restored. According to contemporary observers, this brief period of governance gave rise to what some called an order without a crown. There was no king, but at least there was stability. York's rise, however, also triggered growing anxiety among his rivals. Chief among them was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Previously protected by Margaret and the king, Somerset now found himself stripped of power. By the end of 1454, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. This was not merely a political setback for Somerset, it was, as many contemporaries saw it, a death sentence in disguise. York and his circle held him responsible for England's military failures in France and the internal corruption of the royal court. Meanwhile, Henry VI began to show signs of recovery. Toward the end of 1454, he recognised his son, spoke for the first time in months, and gave his assent to several royal decisions. By early 1455, he had improved to the point where his protectorship was deemed no longer necessary. Margaret moved quickly. She declared the king restored and saw to it that Somerset was released. But York refused to step aside. For him and his allies, Somerset's return to power was unacceptable. What had begun as a political dispute was now becoming something far more dangerous, an armed confrontation between factions. In May 1455, Richard of York, along with the Earls of Warwick and Salisbury, gathered their forces. Their opponents, Somerset, Northumberland and Clifford, stood at the king's side. Margaret of Anjou had successfully restored her faction to royal prominence, but trust between the two sides had completely collapsed. Within weeks, the political standoff would erupt into open conflict. England now stood on the brink of civil war. By the spring of that year, the country was effectively divided. On one side stood the Duke of York, backed by his powerful northern allies, proclaiming a mission of national reform. On the other, the royal court had once again fallen under the control of Margaret's inner circle, with Somerset and his allies at its centre. Although Henry VI had recovered from his mental collapse, he remained passive, a symbolic figure. The true struggle was now between those who ruled in his name. In early May, Henry's government summoned a great council to convene in the town of St Albans. On the surface, it appeared to be an attempt at reconciliation, but for York, it was a trap. Somerset had been released from custody and appeared to be regaining control over the king's decisions. For York, this posed a direct threat, not just to his own safety, but to the balance of power in the kingdom. He interpreted the summons as a chance to reclaim the king and settle the score with Somerset once and for all. The York, Warwick and Salisbury marched south swiftly. The exact size of their army is unknown, but estimates place Yorkist forces between 3,000 and 5,000 men, roughly equal to the king's supporters. Still, this was not a battle defined by size, but by symbolism and strategy. York maintained that he opposed not the king, but those who surrounded him. Yet conflict was now unavoidable. On the morning of May 22nd, Yorkist troops arrived just outside the town of St Albans. It was a modest but strategically placed town, close to London and situated at a key intersection of roads. Crucially, the king himself was present. Henry VI had taken up residence in an inn in the town centre, accompanied by Somerset, Northumberland and Clifford. York initially sought negotiation. He sent envoys demanding the surrender of Somerset. Despite being surrounded, the king refused. As Alison Weir notes, this was the moment when Henry abandoned neutrality and fully aligned himself with his faction. York's plan had been to carry out a quick and targeted assault, seizing Somerset without broader bloodshed. But the town was fortified. Its narrow streets and closely packed houses favoured the defenders. The Royalist side had positioned archers in windows, and the initial Yorkist assault, led by Warwick, was repelled. According to some reports, even local townspeople aided in resisting the attack. At this point, the battle took a decisive turn. Warwick extended the attack from the east, catching the defenders off guard. According to several accounts, this manoeuvre breached the town's perimeter at an unexpected point. Yorkist troops began filtering into the streets through alleyways and side entrances. The fighting lasted no more than 30 minutes, but it was devastating. As Warwick's men pushed into the market square, the king's guards broke ranks. Somerset attempted to flee the upper floor of the inn, but was intercepted by Yorkist soldiers. Though some sources claim he tried to surrender, he was killed on the spot. According to certain chroniclers, he was hacked to death, a scene less like a battle and more like an execution. Both Clifford and Northumberland were also killed that day. King Henry VI was found sheltering in a corner house. When York and Warwick approached, the king reportedly recognised them and told them they could kill him if they wished. But this was symbolic. York had no intention, yet, of harming the king. Instead, they placed him under their protection. Still, the question of who was protecting whom now hung in the air. Militarily, the engagement had been minor. Politically, it was seismic. St Albans marked the official beginning of the Wars of the Roses. For the first time, a royal army had been defeated by a rival noble faction. For the first time, internal court rivalries had spilled into open warfare. And for the first time, a dynastic dispute had become, in the public eye, a national crisis. This moment can best be described as the point at which personal vendettas transformed into political ideology. York was no longer simply opposing corrupt advisers, he was challenging the very structure of royal governance. For Margaret of Anjou, the defeat was devastating. Her husband had failed to assert power, and her most loyal supporters had been killed. From this point on, she would no longer act through the king, she would act for herself,